you had your chance of introducing stuff, I suppose. But
Yes, yeah. So
yeah,
so I introduced the book,
good.
uh, which, by the way, thank you very much for this copy. I'd really like to compliment you on what a physically beautiful book it is.
Well, that's not my thing at all. It's my book publisher who did all of that.
Well, still, I mean, it's a good concept. I mean, I really like, for example, these actual like quasi photographic reproductions in each section of the runes on the stone. I like
I'm
all the
particularly happy
photographs.
about that. That they poured quite a bit of money into the illustrations there.
Yeah, it's extremely well done, and and this definitely is to your credit. It's a very readable book. You really present a case, but also kind of keep it kind of mysterious, right? I mean, like without going too woo, you get it's a very intriguing story that you lay out here. So, Henrik Willems, would you tell us a little bit? First of all, maybe introduce, uh, for the benefit of anyone who maybe hasn't read very much about it, about what the Rookstone is, and then about the work that you've done in the last 2 years since the publication of your major paper in early 2020.
Okay, first a few words about the Runestone itself. It is, of course, the greatest runic monument in the world. Not the biggest as such, but the longest, certainly. It has over 760 characters, mostly runic or coded. And it's covered on all 5 sides, both the back and the front and both the sides, and even on the top. Difficult to read. And most of it is written in plain text, although with the short twig runes, which is an early type of normal runes from the Viking Age. But then there are 4 or 5 sections of encrypted passages. And it was first made known in the 17th century, but it was then part of a building and you could only see the front, and no one could read that type of runes at that time. It wasn't until 1843 when they took it out of this stone building, and for a few hours it was lying on the graveyard, and the local minister then made a drawing of all the sides, and then they built it into the church, which sounds stupid. But that at least got the attention of the scholars. So about 20 years after that, they finally released the stone and put it up for general inspection. And ever since then, there have been, I don't know how many scholars have been trying to solve the puzzle. It took quite a while before they could crack the cryptic parts. The reading now is more or less definite. There are perhaps 1 or 2 places. There is a little bit of damage on one of the corners of the stone, and that was probably inflicted when they took it out of the stone building. I guess, and that's a pity, because that one of the lines then is virtually unreadable. Apart from that, there have been various attempts to solve the contents of the stone, and since 1958, there has been what I would call a standard interpretation of the runestone. And everybody agrees that it starts off the same way, that the father has the runes carved after his son. And the word describing the son, the epithet there is the Icelandic word feigr, which can then either mean just dead, which is the standard interpretation, or the word as its actual meaning is death doomed. And that is the interpretation that as recent interpreters have embraced. And I am one of those, because that would then set the tone of the entire inscription. Why would a dead son be called death doomed? I mean, we're all doomed to die, but why would he be that more than anybody else? The standard interpretation, especially established by Elias Wissen, says then that there are a number of almost legendary tales which may or may not have anything to do with the dead son. And these tales tell about various war booties that were taken in battle from people back and forth, and there are 20 kings dying on a battlefield, and there are various other things. And there's no thread, there's no red line through this. And that is explained by Wissen that the father more or less wanted to show off. He found this wonderful piece of rock, and he found that he had to cover it with this fear of this empty space, and he would then just put on any sort of examples of all the things he knew. He was what you in Iceland would call the thuler, the wise man, or the reteller of stories. And this is, if you look at all the encyclopedias today, that is the interpretation that is established there. What happened, and this is the background of the articles that I suppose that you mentioned before, in 2007, Bo Ralph, professor of Gothenburg, published an article where he could solve the first, he calls them riddles. He thinks the entire stone consists of riddles, and that these war booties, these two war booties that were exchanged between two people 12 times, is really about the sun and the moon exchanging the sunlight 12 times a year, each moon month. And that set the whole interpretational work in a new direction altogether. And that led then to Per Holmqvist publishing an article following the line and cracking another of these riddles in 2016. And then Per founded a little group of 4 people, of which I was one, and we published our article in January 2020. And that's when you and I had a little something on this group. I was at that time asked by the publisher of my present book, Martin Kaunitz, if I could write a popular description of our article in Swedish. So I sat down, or I promised him to do that, fully well knowing that that was a promise I was not going to keep. I do not write books. I write short articles, and I find it hard to keep my mind on one thing for a long time. But then fortunately, the pandemic struck, giving me no time to do anything else but to sit down and actually think about one thing for the first time in 30 years or something. So I got the book done in 6 months, and then it took another year before it was ready to be published because, you know, all the boring stuff afterwards. And what I found was that on several points, I didn't quite adhere to the interpretation in this article of ours. And I think that I have now a more consistent interpretation. It cleaves closer to the Icelandic sources that I think that represent the same kind of world that the Runestone does. And basically that it's all about a hope of a father that his son will end up in the Viking paradise and go on from there after Ragnarök, the final battle, into the second Viking paradise, this Gimle. And that, of course, was basically the same idea as in our first article. But there, a huge part of that was this climate catastrophe in the 6th century. And I don't think anymore that it is directly influencing the Runestone as such. And I don't think that any events around the year 800 necessarily triggered the father in carving this stone. What I do think is that what happened in the 6th century very much affected everything else in Scandinavia at that time, religion, so forth, and that we can see traces of that in most of the mythological poems in the Edda. And that is that religious world that affects and explains why the father does what he does, and the frame of reference that he has, that this is what he hopes for his son. That, in brief, is what happened after 2020.
And what changed your mind about the relative influence of the 536 events on the stone?
Well, first of all, you need to remember that the article, I call it this gang, the Gang of Four. That's what I call the 4 of us. So the Gang of Four, it was a compromise. We all had to kill our darlings, and you know, I had to accept certain things at that time that perhaps I didn't believe fully. But on the other hand, it takes a long time to really think through this inscription. It's incredibly complicated. But first of all, I came to doubt that certain of the events around 800 was really that catastrophic as we had believed previously. For example, there was an eclipse of the sun, which I think was a 95% eclipse. And I've actually experienced such an eclipse once. And it wasn't that dramatic. I mean, of course, things happened, but it was pretty light anyway. It's not as if it was pitch dark. I've never experienced a total eclipse. I don't know if any of you have, but it's said to be.
One time.
You have? Okay.
One time, yeah.
Is it as dramatic as everybody says?
I mean, it's weird, but it lasts like a minute and a half. Right.
It's not midnight, somebody says here on the
Yeah.
no,
It's
but
like
it's certainly, you certainly notice it, right?
yeah, it's weird, but it also, I mean, the one that I saw in Wyoming in 2017 lasted like a minute and a half.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's not very long. It's weird, but it's over before you can blink just about.
Okay. I feel now that an eclipse of the sun, that can be explained as something eating the sun, right? I mean, you see something sort of devouring more and more of the sun disk. If you can look at the sun, which you cannot unless you have a special kind of implement. I mean, we used exposed pieces of film, right?
Right.
To look through. I'm not sure they saw that happening in old times, or did they just notice that the sun's light was diminishing and almost gone, not midnight, but very much different. And then it slowly came back, and that something must have sort of taken it for a while, and then it was released on the other side. I'm thinking now, I'm just speculating here, I have no evidence of this, but can that be the origin of the myth that something devours the sun, but then the sun is reborn? And in the Edda, of course, it's the Fenrir wolf killing the sun, and then she bears a daughter before she dies. But then we would need such a total eclipse of the sun in Scandinavia in these centuries between the 6th century and the 9th century. And I don't think there is one, actually.
Okay.
I have a book that lists every single eclipse from the year 600, but I need to find out. And there are supposed to be tools you can find out, but I haven't managed to do so before 600. So that was one thing. I was no longer really, and we had a lot of criticism because, of course, I think we knew that this was going to be a very popular thing, an idea very much. We're all affected by our own times, right? And we knew that people would hatch onto this. When cooler minds prevailed, I realized that we were putting too much stress on the actual climate catastrophe in the 6th century. But I still do believe that it had a profound effect on society as such. And it's a sort of a secondary effect that affects the mindset of Varin, the father, when he carves this inscription.
Well, and looking at your translation and interpretation, which helpfully, by the way, in the book, you can always flip to the very last page where he has the transliterated Old East Norse text and a Swedish translation. One of the things that really convinced me when I first saw that article 2 years ago, that there was some reference to those events in 536, was the riddle, what was lost 9 generations ago?
Yes.
Right.
And that's the second thing. I think it's perfectly possible that they may actually refer to generations. And that would then put us in the right time, around 536. But on the other hand, the figure 9 can more or less mean a long time ago.
Right.
And that would then rhyme very well. So I'm not tied into this being an exact date anymore.
Right.
Could I just add, when you showed that thing out of my book, that could you do that again? And if you flip on the dust cover, if you remove that, there's actually a fold out there. No, fold back the hardcover. On the inside of the hardcover, there is actually a fold out there too, which I think people miss, unfortunately, because on the back hardcover, there is
something on the back of the jacket. Is that what you mean?
No, not the dust cover. That actual, yes, the back, and there, opposite. There's actually, if you in the middle there, if you look in the very middle of the book, in the
whoa,
yes,
I never saw this.
No, and this is. I'm really sad about this. And actually, this book is now going into its 2nd reprinting because it sold fairly well for such a book. And this is something that I had hoped would have been a true fold out that would have been, really on the outside of the dust cover even, so that people would have noticed it from the very start. But most people, you've had this book for a while and you haven't noticed that. That's something
Yeah.
I did actually for myself, because I have a very poor visual memory. And this was a way for me to envision where was what on the stone. And I wrote then all the runes in blue and all the decrypted enciphered runes in, I don't know what you would call that, purple, whatever, so that I can follow along my own exactly what was what where. And it was very helpful to me. And I thought that perhaps people would like to have that in the book, but as nobody seems to find it.
I love the idea. Well, I mean, now hopefully
Yep.
some people will see this video and know about
And
it.
see that now, yes.
I
And the worst thing is that I sent my own sketch to this very professional guy who did all the stuff in the book. And he thought that he had to copy my ugly letter forms. So it's actually a copy of my original, which looks virtually the same. And I would have been much happier if he had copied it in a nice handwriting. But it, at least it's I think it's readable.
Yeah, it is. I love the idea. I wish I knew about this, because I mean, this is like I said, it was a joy to read. I even went through your Voluspa and bought through the small translations in the back. I mean, it's such a comprehensive look at this stone, and this is a wonderful compliment to it. I just had no idea it was there.
Where the idea was that it was going to be a fold out that you could have sticking out of the book, both of those pages, and while reading the book, so you can constantly make references between the drawings of the actual runes and to where they were in the stone and what they meant, transliterated.
As Estella says, it takes the whole rune as secret thing just a little too far.
Yes,
well, you know,
but that was my publisher, not me.
Putting it on the inside of the jacket might have worked. Right?
Okay.
Just as a thought.
Yeah. On the other hand, they would then have seen, they would have to fold out the back of the jacket. I don't know.
Well, you just take the jacket off of it and look at it that way.
They say that it's too complicated to do what I want, and you don't get it your own way all the time.
Yeah, true enough. Well, I'm glad I know that it's there now. Well, Ola asks, the foldout would be great to bring when visiting the Runestone. Is it available as a downloadable PDF?
No, it's not, but I could ask for permission, because what I have done, unfortunately, I did the index for the book. And while it was completely finished and submitted to the publisher, somebody, I don't know who, made a slight change to the page numbering. Great. Meaning that a good few, 40 or 50 of the references, page references in the index got misplaced by half a page or so, meaning that something that was on the top of one page is now found on the previous page bottom. And in the second printing, this has been corrected, as well another dozen or so corrections. And that index is now found on my our digital archives. If you look for that, you can download that at least, and you get the correct index.
Okay.
And I could ask them if it's okay to put out. I could put out my original. I mean, they don't have copyright on that. Yeah.
Sure. Well, if you wanted to share it, I'd be happy to share it on Patreon or something like that.
We could do that. Yeah.
Well, so what other changes did you make in the interpretation or translation between 2000 and what we see in this book here?
Yeah, I would mention three things. First of all, I have a different reading order, and I'm going to stand by that. I'm fully convinced that I've finally come up with the right reading order. And one of the reasons why I do that is because the person who sat down and really done a study of this, Olof Lundqvist, back 20 years ago, this is the reading order that he reached. And I reached it through different means, the same order. And I think that strengthens the idea. And I have various arguments why this is the reading order. And now the inscription ends on the top of the stone, which feels intuitively like the right place. Mm-hmm. Other people trying to pass over the top, and someone says that, well, you would have to be flying over the top. I just don't believe people flew back then, but what do I know? So that's one thing, the reading order. The second thing is that on the second side of the stone, which has encrypted runes only, which has been interpreted either as I say a memory Thor, the god Thor, or I say a memory Thor, meaning dare.
Mhm.
And we chose in the Gang of Four, we chose the latter because we didn't see any place for Thor. But this dare thing is very stretched as well. And I worked on that for a week and just couldn't accept any of it. And then I realized, wait a minute, I can read, because they never wrote two runes twice. I should say they never wrote two sounds twice if they occurred sort of consecutively. So if one word ends with the same rune as the next word would begin with, it would only write the one rune. So I could introduce an extra I there for the last sequence, and I get the word idur, which means your. So instead of saying, really, then I tell your memories.
I think, by the way, that's a really economical solution to that problem.
I think it's much better than the previous ones, at least. That's, then I'm partial. So
right.
That's one thing. And it would be sort of it also, according to me, it would then start off a sort of second round of almost retelling the same myths as in the first half. It would be sort of a second chapter, and this would then be the headline for the second chapter. And as you know, our previous interpretation, which I still stand by, is that these memories are told for Odin. And that is, people would say, why would you tell it to Odin? You tell it to the people listening to the inscription or reading the inscription. Well, I think it's a two-way thing, because of course Odin knows all of this crap already, right? If you tell him about all the things that are going to happen and all the things that are going to happen, because we know from Völuspá that that's what he's been told. On the other hand, he was told it in that poem as well. And isn't that part of mythology, that things have happened, they are happening at this time, and they will be happening in the future, all at the same time, sort of. So I think it's that's another idea, that it's a twofold audience of this inscription, both reminding Odin as sort of a reassurance that, come on, guy, you know that you promised us that when we die in battle, we will come to you and be among your elite warriors outside Valhalla, and we will be eating bacon every day and drinking beer and fighting each other, waking up the next morning, eating the same poor pig. And finally, it's going to be the battle against the evil powers, the wolf and the Midgard serpent and so forth. And a few lucky ones of us will survive even that final battle and come into the second paradise. So it's sort of exactly the same thing as we do in a Christian burial today. You have this reading out of the Bible, sort of reminding Jesus and God that, this is, you promised, this is what's going to happen to us. And my whole point is that people were no different back then than they are now. And it was funny, I need to tell you this. I gave a lecture in Stockholm, and before then I happened to read the newspaper, and the same day we have these obituary notices. You don't really have them anymore in the States, but when people die, there's a little sort of an ad, and it has a religious symbol first. And it used to be that it was a cross, and the guy who died, they told you about him, and there was a little, either a prayer or something else. And in this case, I think it was somebody from the Salvation Army who had died. And they said, we will be meeting each other in paradise again. That's the old Christian way of looking at it. The same day, there was a very young man, around 30, who died. And he didn't have a cross. He had the motto or logo of his favorite soccer team. And then his name, he was only 30, and the mother and so forth, put him in sad. But then in the end, it says, we'll be seeing each other in Nangijala. And you, Jackson, who read the book, Nangijala is this very famous children's book by Astrid Lindgren about the Lionheart brothers. And they both die, and they come to the first paradise, which is called Nangijala, where they will then, it's not all good because there's an evil power there, Tengil, and they will have to fight the huge monster Katla, both Icelandic names, by the way. And this Katla monster, who's then killed, but manages to burn one of the brothers. So they need to die a second time. And then they come into the second paradise, which is called Nangilima. And this is an idea because there are several proofs of Icelandic influence in this children's book, that Astrid Lindgren took this idea of a double afterlife from Icelandic mythology. As far as I know, there is no such idea anywhere else in any other religion, that there are two paradises. If I'm wrong, please correct me, but no. So I thought that was interesting that people, even though you're no longer a Christian, you still have this hope for an afterlife. And it's a sort of a reassurance for the people who've lost their son. And, things have not changed in this country for 1,200 years. We still have the same hope. The third thing is actually how I interpret the top. And I would then end up with these great X's at the top of the stone. And we had very different reading of that before. I now think that it actually ends up by saying, once again, that the wolf, the fenrir wolf, will not kill the son's daughter, and that she is in the sea of the holy powers, which sounds kind of atrocious, but actually that is the home, the abode of sun and moon. They rise and set in the sea, right? So you'll have to read the book for this. And I should add, unless you've done so already, that there are some people who don't read Swedish, I suppose. And even those who do, even colleagues of mine, even though this book, I've tried to make it as easy as possible to read, dividing it from a popular part and then having these more scholarly notes as endnotes. It's still not an easy read. I think you would agree with that, right?
I don't know. I thought it was, but
okay. Well, then you're smarter than most other people. I'm happy to hear that you said so. But also, the Icelandic part. Their history of religion. Not a lot of people don't. So, but there is actually underway currently a translation into English.
Oh, nice.
Done by Minda McLeod in Melbourne.
Excellent.
Who's done stuff for us before, and if we find a book publisher in the United States or somewhere else who would accept this book, which is much more popular, it's got rid of all the academic stuff as far as possible, and none of the notes or the appendices or anything like that. Just trying to make this as understandable to normal people who have no idea of Swedish or Scandinavian or anything at all. If we don't find a publisher for it, we'll just put it out as a PDF for anyone to access.
I just wanted to come back to when you were talking about the one side, what you take as section 8, where, instead of saying Thor or Thor's and dare, you read is or your. But of course, the earlier part of that same line has also been something that's really tortured a lot of translations and interpretations of the stone. The part that reads, if you just read it out in Futhark, Sakum uk mini, there have been so many different interpretations of that. So you take that as, I tell Odin Ig a memory.
Yes.
What makes you favor, how did that take shape in your mind over other interpretations? I know that you were just explaining how you saw this as reciting memories for Odin, kind of analogous to something like Völuspá. What can you tell us a little bit of your thought process in coming to that?
Well, that's very easy because it wasn't my thought process at all. It was originally proposed by a real dilettante in our field, Rolf Nordenström, who did nothing else worthwhile in his entire life, but wrote a very short notice in 1912 where he suggested that this uk should be an ig. And not a person, I don't even reference that for a long time. So that was Per Holmberg, who picked that up and said that he thought that this was correct and that what we're telling this memory is for ygg, which of course is what Odin is called in Vafthrudnismál, which is the lay, I don't know what is it in English, the lay of Vafthrudnir, or what do you call it? Well, this Eddic poem anyway. Yeah. That's what Odin is called in that poem, which is the poem that is the closest in structure and contents to the Runestone to begin with. So it's very fitting that he would be referenced to as ygg here. So that was from him. And the word minni, memory, I have taken that from Ottar Grönvik, another Rök scholar, a Norwegian runologist, who defines Mini as a myth, a divine myth, which suits my interpretation extremely well. So you're sort of retelling a myth for Odin, and for Odin means both you're telling it for him, to him, but also on his behalf to the people receiving this message, either by reading the inscription, which I think extremely few people could do, but by being retold either by people who could read or by people who knew what was going to be there.
Yeah, and you're right. And that's another really compelling point, is how difficult it would be for a person coming across the stone in a field to just read it. I mean, parts of it, the very first lines are fairly readable if you just know short twig runes. But then, I mean, basically as soon as you've walked one turn around the stone, you're getting into stuff that's pretty confusing. I think probably one of the hardest things, well, I mean, aside from the X's on top that are basically just ciphers or coded, is the use of Elder Futhark in place of Younger Futhark, but it's not the Elder Futhark system. It's still the Younger Futhark system.
Exactly.
I mean, it's so weird. It's like someone learned Elder Futhark, but not that these letters actually represented different sounds than the ones represented in Younger.
No,
it's just such
exactly
a weird.
That they use the 16 type Futhark.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, and that is to me the strongest evidence that this stone has to be fairly old, because it's the last attestation we have of the older runes. And it's simply inconceivable for me to think that that could happen anytime much later after 800. Otherwise, it's very difficult to date the stone. There are a number of very archaic features, but there are some newer features as well, typologically newer features as well. But the problem is we can't date when these things happened.
Right. I mean, I see what you mean about there being kind of a combination of archaic and newish features. For example, the use of the nasal rune, right? The os for even short nasals, like in standa.
Yeah.
And then there's strange things that to me are almost unique to the stone, like the B, the Bjarkan is so weird.
Well, it's actually, when I wrote the book, I was under the impression that the short twig runes used on the Rökstone was the oldest type of short twig runes. But just as was being published, there was an article put out by Magnus Källström, who's a great runologist here in Sweden. And he thinks that these are not perhaps the very oldest type, but perhaps the second oldest or so, which would then give at least room to make the stone a little bit younger than previously thought. But again, it doesn't really matter to me. Even I don't for a second believe that is as late as 900 AD. But even if it were, it doesn't change anything for me, actually, because it would only then mean that the 9 generations cannot specifically mean 270 years anymore. It just means a long time.
Well, and on top of that, anyway, as you said, 9 can be a sort of stand-in for a large number, right?
That's what I guess.
That makes perfect sense. Other questions from the audience? I was also going to ask if, here we are. John Phillips asks, this probably opens a whole other can of worms to scholars, but do you keep an eye open for likely typos that could occur on runestones? I imagine you have to stick with what's recorded, but I'm curious if it's present in your mind.
There are typos on the Rökstone, at least 2 definite typos. One is where there is a ligature of 2 runes. We call them bind runes, right? When they share the common main staff, sort of, and then add the twigs on both sides. It's in Radulv. It's a name on the back side of the stone. Since that only occurs once, and Minnie Cloud that I mentioned earlier wrote her dissertation on bind runes. In the Viking Age, they don't use bind runes to abbreviate stuff. They use it only for corrections. When they've done something wrong, they realize, okay, I can put the twig on that previous rune and then it'll spell out fine. And then there's another rune at the very end of a line that there is no place for the twig on the right side that it should have been. So they put it on the left side instead, a reversed rune. And I'm absolutely sure because it comes towards the end of the backside where the runes are getting smaller and smaller and squeezed together. They realize they run out of space. Anyone who's ever done one of those placards for a demonstration, will notice that you start off by, using a pencil and just writing whatever you want, and then you fill it in with the thickest, what do you call those markers? Well, a marker, I guess. And realize that they take much more space than the pencil did.
Right.
You ran out of space towards the right end of the placard. So I think that's pretty much the same. They must have planned this very well anyway, because otherwise they couldn't fit it in. But they didn't plan it perfectly, obviously.
Sure. Well, but how could you? I mean, honestly, when one of the things that I think sort of speaks to forgeries, not that, which another subject we could go on about a little bit, unrelated to this one, is sometimes the runes are like too perfect looking, like aesthetically, and too consistent in shape. You know what I mean? Like it's like people think that it was just sort of printed off, but real
on the Runestone?
No. I mean on forgeries.
Yes, that's true.
Right.
There's always an individuality. Every single rune does differ a little tiny bit from any other rune, but you can still usually tell if it's one or more people who've carved an inscription. And we have examples where we can actually tell two people, they both signed the stone, and we can tell exactly which passages have been carved by one person and which have been carved by the other. That was discovered by Claiborne and Thompson, who wrote the first modern dissertation on runes in 1975, or it was published in 1975.
Right, the sort of carving handwritings that are distinct
exactly.
for particular people, yeah. In the announcement on Patreon, Martha had been asking, although it seems like you've kind of answered this, about whether there could be one of the events in 536 that might have reached Scandinavia was the Plague of Justinian. It sounds like so you're not as wedded to the 536 narrative now, but do you know if the Plague of Justinian reached Scandinavia?
I don't. I'm sure somebody would know, because I think you would find remnants of that. Was it a virus or a bacillus? Was it some kind of bug in, at least?
Yeah, I thought it was a bacillus, but I don't know.
Yeah, but once people got, and this idea of this climate catastrophe in 536 to 547, that's a fairly new discovery, right? It's only like 20 years back when they started finding remnants of these volcano eruptions in glaciers and so forth. Once that was realized, I think that now we understand why the Justinian plague happened in 540, because people's resistance was so much lowered after the climate. I talked to a climate historian and said there has been no worse famine in human history than the one between 536 and 547. Wow. 11 years in a row without proper harvests. I mean, that will just, in Scandinavia, 3/4 of all people in certain areas died out.
Well, it would certainly leave a scar on a culture. And I mean, it's to me, it's a really compelling notion that this is part of what inspires the narratives around Ragnarok, because generations back, someone experienced something very like what's described in Ragnarok. Everyone turning against everyone else, the sun black, winter year round. And it does sound quite a bit like that catastrophe.
Or a normal Swedish winter.
Not a Colorado winter. Now in Colorado, we just have wildfires all winter.
Okay.
Other questions from the audience? Let's see if anybody's got something.
Can I butt in? I would have two. I guess they are only tangentially connected to the Runestone, but the first one is, do we have any kind of sources or information about the actual people who made the runestones? I mean, the runestone itself says who ordered the runestones, but do we have any information on who carved them, or on the profession of rune carver, if you could call it that?
That's a very good question. And the short answer is no, we don't, but we can always speculate. And the first question, of course, is, did the father himself carve the stone or did he not? It's a very long inscription. I think it must have taken at least a month to do the actual carving. if he was some kind of a petty king, which I believe he was, I don't think that he would probably hold the chisel himself. But I do think perhaps that he was the one who sketched, perhaps with a piece of coal or something on the actual stone, or even carved shallow lines or something like that for somebody else to do the hard work. It's a tough job carving in stone. But of course, we don't know this. They've done some kind of laser scan of the stone, but I don't think it's been analyzed as to the number of carvers who's been involved. I never heard that it would be more than one anyway. If that was Odin himself or somebody, some slave or thrall, or even just a pupil. We have a slightly later stone from approximately the same area, the Skjervestenssten, which is signed by two carvers. And one of them, incidentally, is called Viking. I think that's pretty fine. So it seems as if people were, they signed their names to inscriptions fairly early, but we don't have anything that seems to be contemporary. And you should remember that out of the 3,000 or so rune stones we have from Sweden, we're talking of 0.1% that come from this very early time. It's an extremely low number. In my book, I mentioned, I think, like half a dozen or so from the same province, which is one of the richest provinces from the early Viking Age. And then we're just discussing all the time from 750 to 950, almost a quarter of a century, right? So it's a long time. And in that time, they're only in the entire Scandinavia, even with a very liberal definition, in a quarter of a century there, you only have, I think it's 134 inscriptions or something like that.
Yeah, that is notably little. And actually, some of these inscriptions you pointed out, I had never seen.
No, they're not very well known. But my favorite one that you should look at is the Ingelstad inscription, which was a pièce de résistance for me in my discussion of the sun, because it's an inscription on the rock face. And it's very small, it's a tiny one. And it says that somebody made a sun. And then there is an actual sun carved into the rock.
I'm trying to find the picture.
A hole with rays coming out of it. So I don't know what that means, but it means that people at approximately the same time as the Encrypted Runes, there it is. Actually, if you look at Ingelstad on the internet, you will find pictures of it. They were interested in the sun. That's all I can say for sure. So yeah, it's not totally out of the incredible that they would be interested in that on the Runestone as well.
So when I come to Sweden in August, I need to see if I can go to this one. Maybe we ought to go together if you're around.
We should, if I'm there, we're going to go to Rök, and we should. It's not too far away, and we can also see Utlunda, which is another wonderful inscription. And all runic, it's like in 1984. All rune stones are equal, but some rune stones are more equal than others.
Okay.
The ones we're talking about now, they're the most equal.
Yeah. Well, I want to. Let's definitely do this. Did the Pike Spy have?
Yes, question? I was. The second question, though I think you've already touched on it, was. I guess there's sort of. Does like a runic handwriting exist, and do you have any cases where, I mean, you probably don't have like a name or a biography, but like, can you identify certain runestones that were very likely written by the same person? Is that possible?
Not as the Rök runestone. We don't have any other inscription. There is one possible candidate. It's on the island of Visingsö, which is in the rather great lake nearby the Rök runestone. Some decades back, they found a small piece of a runestone that has the same type of runes, and actually one of the same words, this word sakkum, is found on that. And, you could speculate that it could be the same carver. I don't think it is. And this is strange, but how can you create such a masterpiece as a one-off? There are no traces that this person ever trained to become a runologist to carve this thing, or a runographer, I should say, and there are no traces of people keeping on doing this afterwards. And that just blows my mind. This person had to practice. My God, you can't just do that. I tried to carve a runestone once, and it's just, I gave up after half a rune. It's very difficult. So, but then in later Viking times, yes, we have lots of evidence of that. And Magnus Källström, that I mentioned earlier, wrote his dissertation on rune carvers. So he's the expert on these matters. And he can then, when we find a new runestone, he can usually say, well, that was carved by so-and-so because, there's a certain twirl to the tail, or you can see the nose here, or that rune form, or the spelling of this word. It's just incredible.
That's an incredible skill. Stella also asked, would you be willing to give a short summary on your work on putative American runic inscriptions?
What? If it's an option, I would be very happy to come back and talk about that because I love this topic. And but to give a short, it's just so interesting, and there's so much to say that I really wouldn't want to spoil it by talking 5 minutes or so. You couldn't stop me after 5 minutes, and my family would get really irritated.
Let's have you back to do that, and let's count on this meetup. And all
next time I promise to be on time. I'm really, really sorry about that. I'm never late usually. I don't know what got into me.
Did you see my April Fool's video last year, by the way?
If I did, I've forgotten it. I'm sorry.
So we found the Kittredge runestone. It was a little bit of a Kensington knockoff, but we found it in Colorado. It's a joke.
Yeah.
So we found a runestone in Colorado, but it was with a dinosaur skeleton. So it shows the Vikings got here not just a few hundred years before other Europeans, but 65 million years before other Europeans.
No, I would have remembered that. Could you please send me the link to that?
I'll send you a link. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I know you said you need to get to dinner. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about the Rookstone and your new book. And we'll look forward to the English translation. And if you can get the this picture, if you can get permission for me to share it, that'd be great.
Yeah, I certainly will.
All right. Well, best regards to your family, and thank you so much for your time. And
you know what? I'll actually share that drawing of mine with you immediately. So if you just stay online for 5 minutes afterwards, I can.
Yeah, if you just email it to me or something. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And
all right.
I'm happy to come back. And give this more time.
Yeah, let's do it. All right.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
All the best, everybody.